Hello friends, this video on ratio and proportion part 1 is brought to you by examfear.com. No more fear from exam. Topics to be covered in this lesson are introduction, why ratio, comparing quantities with ratios, proportion, unitary method, problem solving with ratio and proportion. Now, let us first try to understand what is ratio and proportion. So basically, where do we need ratio and proportion? So as we gradually move ahead with the chapter, we will get to know what is ratio, how do we use it. We will also get to know what is proportion. First, let's see where do we need them. Let's look at this example. So these are two sisters, and let's say we are interested to know who is taller. Now, of course, looking at the picture itself, you can guess who is taller, but let's go by measurements. So let's say that the elder sister named Maria, let's say that her name is Maria, and the younger sister, her name is, let's say, Rita. So who is taller? And let's say that height of Maria is 138 centimeters. And height of Rita is 125 centimeters. Now looking at these two numbers, you need to decide who is taller. Now of course, you will say that, okay, so who is taller would be decided by the numbers. So whichever number is bigger, whether it is 138 or 125, whichever is bigger, that person is going to be taller. So in this case, 138 is greater than 125. So we can say that Maria is taller. Perfect, that's fine. Now when we are comparing, so in this case we are comparing heights of the two sisters. Now let's say if I ask you that how much is Maria taller than Rita? That means we are now not only looking at just a mere comparison, we are also looking at by how much is the difference. So if I ask you that how tall is Maria when compared to Rita? So that comparison, how do you do that comparison? One way of doing that comparison is you find the difference between these two numbers. So that could be your option 1. One option is you find the difference, that is 138 minus 125, which is 13. So you say that Maria is 13 centimeters taller than Rita. So that's one way of comparing Maria's height with respect to Rita. Now there could be another option where you actually find out the ratio of Maria's height to Rita's height. So you find out Maria's height divided by Rita's height. And you say that Maria's is 138 by 125 times taller than Rita. So that is another way of comparing their heights. Okay, maybe that is getting too much in the first slide. Okay, so in this lesson, we are basically going to compare quantities. Now, not only compare in the sense greater than, less than, we are also going to talk about how much greater than, like how much is one quantity with respect to the other quantity. So something of that sort. So some comparison is going to happen in this lesson. So let's look at one more example. Now here we see that Mr. and Mrs. Smith are going on a long drive, and for some time Mr. Smith drove the car, and for some of the time Mrs. Smith drove the car. So it was found that Mrs. Smith drove the car for 3/4 of the distance. So whatever was the total distance, 3/4 of that distance was covered by Mrs. Smith, and the remaining 1/4 of the distance was covered by Mr. Smith. So what is this 3/4 and 1/4? So 3/4, 1/4, these are nothing but fractions because they are not whole. So they are telling a part of a whole, 3/4 of the complete distance. So these are examples of fractions. Okay, now if I ask you to compare the distance covered by Mrs. Smith with the distance covered by Mr. Smith. So if I tell you that who covered more distance, so obviously you would say that for that we need to compare these two fractions, 3/4 and 1/4, and we see that 3/4 is greater than 1/4. Therefore Mrs. Smith covered more distance. So that's fine. But now when we are going more deep into comparing, we would ask you that how much distance was covered by Mrs. Smith with respect to Mr. Smith. So how do you compare the distance covered by Mrs. Smith with respect to Mr. Smith? How will you do that comparison? Now looking at these, you can see that Mrs. Smith covered 3 times the distance covered by Mr. Smith. 3 times. Let's say that 3 times the distance covered by Mr. Smith. Right? So Mrs. Smith covered 3 times distance covered by Mr. Smith. That means if Mr. Smith covered 1/4, then Mrs. Smith covered 3 into 1/4. That is 3/4. So there we talk about ratio, because when you say this, what you are basically doing is you are saying distance covered by Mrs. Smith divided by distance covered by Mr. Smith. That is what you are actually doing in this case. So you are comparing the two quantities by division. So you are dividing the two quantities to find out a comparison, that how much distance did Mrs. Smith cover compared to Mr. Smith. So Mrs. Smith covered 3 times the distance covered by Mr. Smith. So this sort of comparison is what we discuss in ratio.
Thank you. Please visit examfear.com for free quality education. You can learn with a simple 4-step learning process wherein you can watch video lessons, you can ask your questions, you can refer notes, and you can take a free online test. We have content for class 6 to 12 on physics, chemistry, mathematics, and biology along with practical videos. So please subscribe to our channel for daily updates. Thank you.